Lesson 71, More About Pronouns. Up to this point, we've been talking to our listeners and readers about the fact that Greek verbs include a pronoun. The word eimi, which means I am, it includes the idea of I and the idea of the verb am. It includes both of those things all in one word. So we've been drawing a distinction between English and Greek by saying that in English, we have these separate pronouns, like the word I. But in Greek, the verb eimi includes the word I. So we've been really driving that point home.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's a bit more to talk about, right?
Right, because Greek also has pronouns that are separate.
You know, I used to know a pronoun. He started out as an amateur noun, but then he became a professional noun, and so now he's a pronoun.
Well, pronouns are pros at replacing nouns.
That's right. The word pronoun literally means in place of a noun.
Yeah, it comes from Latin, but that's the idea.
Right. The Latin word pro can mean in place of, instead of, and then noun. So pronoun, literally in place of a noun.
Exactly. So now we're kind of giving our listeners an overview of pronouns in order to move to actual Greek pronouns in the future.
And so with that in mind, I wanted to throw in this lesson to talk about just pronouns in a general sense, what they do, why we have them, and to answer the question that our readers might be asking here, as I say in the book. Now, you may be wondering, if Greek verbs already include pronouns, why does the Greek language need to have separate pronoun words too? Why do we need those separate pronouns if the verbs already have them? And I think that's a valid question. I'm glad you asked.
Exactly.
So over the next few lessons, we're going to learn Greek pronouns, and we're going to be adding those in with the verbs we know. But why do we need to do that? What value will those pronouns give us? What will they do for us that we couldn't have done before?
Right, and there's several different things.
Not everyone will agree with the things that I argue for in this lesson. Some people might see things differently. Nevertheless, I think that this lesson can still just demonstrate the possible value of pronouns for expressing language in a clear and unambiguous kind of way. So what I'm really saying in this lesson, Catherine, is that pronouns help people express themselves clearly and exactly.
Right. And it avoids redundancy, it avoids ambiguity. So it's not just being clear and precise, it's also being efficient with language a lot of the time. So for the times when we don't want to repeat someone's name, it's clear, but it's also efficient to say he rather than a man's name twice. So Michael is wearing a new shirt. Michael bought it yesterday is repetitive, but Michael is wearing a new shirt. He bought it yesterday is still clear, but it's more efficient than saying Michael twice.
That's right, Catherine. Using a pronoun can help you avoid redundancy, and it can help you avoid repeating yourself over and over. And it can help you avoid repetition. But all joking aside, as you can see in that example above, the preposition he allowed us to not repeat the word Michael. Now, this next example is one in which some people might disagree with me, and that's perfectly okay. This is just my opinion. And really, this example is just to raise awareness of what pronouns can do. So let's look at these two sentences. Let's compare them. And Catherine, I'll actually be interested to get your opinion on this. So I have the same sentence constructed in two different ways. One, with the pronoun that is the subject of the sentence delayed until later in the sentence. And then another construction where the pronoun has been moved to the front of the sentence. So here are the two sentences. While walking to work, thinking about Greek, I stopped for coffee. Okay, here's the second one. I, while walking to work, thinking about Greek, stopped for coffee. So I personally would argue that the second sentence is more clear because in the second sentence, the subject is stated up front. And so from the very beginning of the sentence, I know how to process the other information given about the subject. When it talks about walking to work, I know that it's referring to the speaker doing that. When it talks about thinking about Greek, I know that the speaker is doing that. I know how to classify or interpret those thoughts. But in the first one, when it says, while walking to work, thinking about Greek, I don't really know who that's talking about until later, until just a few words from the end of the sentence, we get the word I, and then I know who it's talking about. So there's kind of a delay in being able to interpret the sentence as a whole. So I would argue that the second sentence has an element of clarity that the first sentence does not have. And the reason for that is because the pronoun did some work up at the front of the sentence. So I'm curious to know, Catherine, your opinion about this.
So I would agree that the second sentence is clearer. Depending on what the author wants to do, the author might choose to use the first sentence just to build some sort of uncertainty or suspense or something like that, because that first sentence does not clarify who's being talked about until nearly the end of the sentence. Some authors in other languages, particularly in Latin, you'll find Cicero doing this, will actually do it for effect, where they'll hold an essential part of the sentence until the end and kind of keep the reader in suspense, but that is less clear. So the second sentence would be more clear because it's very upfront about what the subject is.
You know, if you're telling a joke or something, you tell the joke, and then before the punchline, you say, wait for it, to build suspense. So I freely admit that the second sentence is clunky. It doesn't smoothly, roll off the tongue. From a writing perspective, it is clunky. However, it's crystal clear as far as how it communicates meaning.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And so, as you mentioned a moment ago, Catherine, this really pertains to a writer's personal style.
Mm-hmm.
There are all kinds of different ways or styles in which you can write English. You can write like Hemingway. You can write like Faulkner. So you can write in any style you want. That's up to the choice of the author, the choice of the writer.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying here is that where you put a pronoun can really change the way a sentence communicates.
Absolutely. And our listeners will find that certain authors sometimes will put a pronoun up front in order to emphasize it and say, hey, look, I'm talking about this person rather than this other person. And so word placement will often be there for effect as well.
Especially in classical literature, they say all the time that fronting a word, putting the word in the front of the sentence, can emphasize it. Because in a written context, you don't have the element of speech. In speech, I can use the volume of my voice to emphasize a certain word.
Right.
If I say, I'm going to the store, that's different than if I say, I'm going to the store. And that's different than if I say, I'm going to the store.
Right.
I can emphasize any word I want in colloquial speech, but in writing, you can't do that because there's no volume knob on the, if you're reading a book, there's no volume knob on the book. So writers can use word order to emphasize things in ways that are helpful in a written text that you might not do in speech. So, Catherine, you prefer the first sentence. I prefer the second one, even though it's clunky, and that's just a style choice.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of which one you prefer, I think we can both agree that the pronoun placement makes a big difference.
Absolutely. And the second sentence is clearer.
And that's really all I want to do in this lesson is raise the awareness of the listener or reader about what pronouns can do, just to get them thinking about pronouns in general so they can start to think about them in Greek. That's really what I want to accomplish in this lesson. Let's cover a couple of more quick examples here. Broccoli tastes terrible, That's kind of a general statement, but I could also limit it. I could say, to me, broccoli tastes terrible. And so in this sentence, the word me is a pronoun. Our readers have not studied that particular kind of pronoun yet. They will in the future, but it is in fact a pronoun. And so by doing that, I can limit and clarify my opinion about broccoli. And then finally, there's another example that really talks about active verbs versus passive verbs. If I say mistakes were made, I'm using a certain kind of verb construction called a passive verb.
So there's no pronoun involved, which makes it very ambiguous about who made the mistakes.
Right. If I say mistakes were made, well, who made them? We don't know. And that's why, and frankly, that's why politicians do that, because they don't want to admit they made a mistake. So they can speak in that passive voice. That's the grammatical term for this, is the passive voice. Or if we switch that same sentence to the active voice, we can say, I made mistakes. Now the verb is an active verb, and the pronoun I shows who did the action. I did it. I made the mistake. Again, as I've said many times, a pronoun can help you to speak more expressively, more specifically, more clearly. And in this case, it can help you identify clearly the subject of a sentence, expressing it in a clear way instead of the more ambiguous or vague way that you can do with a passive voice verb. Mistakes were made. So in this particular example, I'm pointing out what a pronoun can do in conjunction with a certain kind of verb. But my point is still the same. Pronouns can add clarity and expressiveness.
I think that's the main thing that pronouns do in Greek as well, is to add clarity, add emphasis, add expression, as we see in English. But in Greek, because pronouns are not exactly necessary most of the time, there's almost an underlining that happens when they do pop up. And so the expressiveness angle becomes more important.